Housemaid screams, "She didn't die, your mother is in the asylum," after seeing the forbidden portrait in the mansion. The millionaire freezes. The forgotten image on the wall brings back a pain he never understood. The truth, buried beneath forged documents and forced silence, begins to leak through the corridors of the house. And while everyone tries to contain the scandal, he sets out to find his mother. Not knowing if she still remembers who he is, the afternoon fell slowly over the gardens of the Ashford Kane mansion in the Kensington district of London. The pink azaleas contrasted with the impeccable green of the lawn, where a gardener worked in silence, trimming every leaf that dared to stray from the perfect alignment. Inside the house, protected by high walls and wrought-iron gates, a woman watched from a second-floor window as the shadows lengthened over the plants she herself had chosen decades ago. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford Kane was 72 years old and had a memory as sharp as a razor. Her brown eyes, which had once shone with the joy of someone who had built an empire alongside her husband, now carried the weight of someone who sees what others prefer to ignore. She wore a beige linen suit, elegant without being ostentatious, and around her neck was the pearl necklace she had received on her wedding day. That necklace was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of continuity, of promises fulfilled, of generations succeeding one another under the same roof. Edward, her only son, had inherited not only the family name and business, but also the responsibility of keeping the Ashford Kane tradition alive. Tall, with broad shoulders and a serious gaze, he was the spitting image of the father who had passed away 15 years earlier. He worked every day at the family company's office, a building materials distributor that served the entire southeast region and had contracts with the capital's largest construction firms. Edward had always been methodical, careful with every decision, respectful of his mother's opinion, until he met Chloe. Chloe Davis arrived in Edward's life like a fragrant whirlwind. She was everything he never expected to find: extroverted, decisive, ambitious. The daughter of merchants from a small town in the Midlands, she grew up hearing that she needed to carve out her own space in the world because no one would hand her anything on a silver platter. When she moved to London at 22, she brought with her a degree in business administration and a fierce determination to never return to the modest life she had known. They met at a charity gala hosted by the company. Edward was there out of social obligation. Chloe, invited by a friend who worked in the events industry, saw the environment as an opportunity to network. She wore a simple black dress, but knew how to move through the room as if she belonged in that world. When her eyes met Edward's, something ignited between them, an immediate magnetic attraction that neither of them could ignore. In the following months, their relationship intensified. Chloe was engaging, interested in everything Edward told her about the business, about the family's history, about the challenges of keeping a company competitive amidst market fluctuations. She asked intelligent questions, offered suggestions, showed interest in every detail. Edward, accustomed to carrying the weight of responsibilities alone since his father's death, felt understood, welcomed. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about sharing his life with someone. Mrs. Eleanor observed everything from a distance, with the prudence of one who has seen many stories begin with enthusiasm and end in regret. She had nothing against Chloe at first. The young woman was polite, knew how to conduct herself at formal dinners, treated Edward with affection. But there was something in the way she looked at the house, at the antique furniture, at the works of art on the walls. A look that assessed, calculated, measured. Mrs. Eleanor knew that glint in the eye well. It was the same one she saw in eager buyers during difficult negotiations, a mixture of desire and strategy. The wedding took place 2 years later, in a discreet ceremony at the family chapel, followed by an elegant dinner in the mansion's main hall. Chloe wore a French lace gown, her hair in a low chignon, and smiled at the guests with the ease of someone who had always belonged there. Mrs. Eleanor, watching her daughter-in-law during the waltz, felt a tightness in her chest, an unsettling intuition she tried to dismiss. After all, Edward was happy, and her son's happiness was all a mother could wish for. The first few months of living together were harmonious. Chloe quickly adapted to the household routine, to Mrs. Eleanor's constant presence, to the social obligations that came with the Ashford Kane name. She attended charity teas, organized dinners for important clients, accompanied Edward on business trips. Gradually, she began to suggest changes. Small things, at first. Replacing the living room curtains with something more modern. Renovating the office to make it more functional. Hiring a press officer to improve the company's image on social media. Mrs. Eleanor did not object. After all, the house needed updating. The world was changing, and it was natural for the new generation to want to make its mark. But when Chloe began to question financial procedures, to suggest changes to old contracts, to propose partnerships with companies Mrs. Eleanor had never heard of, the matriarch started to pay real attention. It was during a monthly meeting in which Mrs. Eleanor still participated as an honorary advisor that she noticed the first concrete sign. Chloe was presenting a financial report on a new line of investments. The numbers looked impressive. Accelerated growth, guaranteed returns, strategic partnerships. But something didn't add up. Mrs. Eleanor, who had spent decades reading balance sheets and auditing accounts, noticed subtle inconsistencies, figures that didn't quite tally, dates that made no sense, transfers that seemed to follow an unusual pattern. After the meeting, she asked to speak with Edward alone. They sat in the library, surrounded by mahogany shelves laden with books that Edward's grandfather had collected. Mrs. Eleanor chose her words carefully. She didn't want to sound like a meddling mother-in-law, but she couldn't ignore what she saw. "Edward, my son, I need to talk to you about something delicate." His mother's serious tone made Edward put down the papers he was leafing through. "Of course, Mother, what is it?" "It's about the reports Chloe presented today. There are a few things that have me concerned, some numbers that don't seem to fit together completely. I think we need to request an independent audit before moving forward with these investments." Edward frowned. "Chloe worked for weeks on those reports, Mother. She's extremely careful. Perhaps you've gotten confused with some of the data." Mrs. Eleanor felt the first cut. Her son, who had always trusted her judgment, was now questioning her ability to understand numbers. She herself had taught him to read. "I'm not confused, Edward. I know these spreadsheets better than anyone in this house, and I'm telling you there's something wrong. It's not an accusation, it's a warning. We need to verify it." Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mother, you need to understand that things have changed. The market doesn't work the way it used to. Chloe has studied current trends. She knows what she's doing." Mrs. Eleanor felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Not because of her son's distrust, but because of the certainty that something much larger was at stake, something she couldn't yet name but which she felt growing like a shadow within her own home. "Very well, Edward. I only ask that you be vigilant, and that you trust your mother, as you always have." He stood up, kissed her forehead with his usual tenderness, but there was a new distance in the gesture. "I do trust you, Mother, but I also trust my wife, and I ask that you try to trust her too." When Edward left the library, Mrs. Eleanor was left alone among the books and the silence. For the time in many years she felt afraid, not of an uncertain future, but of the possibility that she was seeing something no one else wanted to see. The following weeks brought a change in the atmosphere of the house. Chloe, who had always been cordial with her mother-in-law, began to treat her with a cold, distant politeness. Conversations at the dinner table became superficial. Family dinners, once moments of sharing and storytelling, were now formal gatherings where every word seemed measured, weighed, calculated. Mrs. Eleanor tried to reach out a few times, suggesting outings, resuming conversations about the garden they had so loved planning together. But Chloe always had an excuse, an important meeting, an unavoidable commitment, a call that couldn't wait. Edward, immersed in his work and the growing responsibilities of the company, didn't notice the chasm opening between the two most important women in his life. It was on an October morning, as autumn began to colour the gardens of London, that Chloe made the announcement that would change everything. She was pregnant. The news was received with euphoria by Edward, who had dreamed of being a father since their wedding. Mrs. Eleanor hugged her daughter-in-law sincerely. Regardless of the tensions between them, a baby was always a blessing, a new life, a continuation of the family story. But something changed in the way Chloe looked at her mother-in-law from that day on. There was a new firmness in her eyes, a confidence that hadn't been there before. As if the pregnancy gave her a power she had not previously possessed. She was now not only the wife, but the mother of the future heir. And that position, Mrs. Eleanor realized with a pang in her heart, completely shifted the balance of power within that house. The months of pregnancy brought visible transformations. Edward surrounded Chloe with care, attended to her every request, adjusted his entire routine to ensure she was always comfortable. The house was reorganized to accommodate the baby's room, with imported furniture and impeccable decor. Chloe chose every detail with obsessive attention, from the color of the walls to the type of fabric for the curtains. Mrs. Eleanor offered help several times, but her suggestions were politely ignored. When she mentioned that the family cradle, a century-old rosewood piece that had rocked 3 generations, was stored in the attic and could be restored, Chloe just smiled and said she preferred something more modern, safer, more in line with current pediatric standards. Edward didn't question it. He was too radiant with the impending arrival of his child to notice the signs. He didn't see that his mother was gradually being pushed away from important decisions. He didn't realize that conversations about the company's future now happened only between him and Chloe in the privacy of their room, without the presence of the matriarch who for decades had guided the business with a firm hand and strategic vision. It was in the 5th month of pregnancy that Chloe began to make subtle comments about Mrs. Eleanor's behavior, always in Edward's presence, always with a tone of delicate, almost affectionate concern. "Darling, have you noticed your mother has been a bit confused lately?" Edward looked up from the tablet where he was reviewing reports. "Confused? What do you mean?" "Yesterday she asked me 3 times if I had already had lunch, and the day before, when we were talking about the charity tea, she couldn't remember approving the caterer she herself had recommended last week." Edward frowned. "My mother has always been very lucid. Maybe she was just distracted." Chloe moved closer, placing a hand on her husband's arm with studied tenderness. "I know, darling, and that's exactly why I'm worried. She's a strong woman, always has been, but she's also getting older. It's natural for some things to start to fail. Memory, attention, perception. We need to keep an eye on it." Edward felt a discomfort grow in his chest. The idea that his mother, the woman who had always been his safe harbor, could be losing her lucidity was too painful to consider. "I'll watch more closely," he said, more to himself than to Chloe. In the following days, he began to pay attention to his mother's every word, every gesture, every lapse of memory. And the more he looked for signs of confusion, the more he found them. Not because they actually existed, but because Chloe knew exactly how to plant doubts. A question here, a suggestion there, a seemingly innocent comment that made Edward reinterpret completely normal behaviors. Mrs. Eleanor noticed the change in her son's gaze. Where there was once trust, there was now constant vigilance. Edward would interrupt her mid-sentence to ask if she was sure of what she was saying. He questioned her memories. He double-checked information she gave as if he needed to validate every word. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, Mrs. Eleanor went up to her room and stood before the mirror. She observed her own reflection carefully, her grey hair tied in an elegant chignon, her skin marked by time but still firm, her eyes tired but absolutely conscious. She knew who she was. She knew what she saw. She knew her mind was as sharp as it had ever been. But she also knew with a clarity that hurt that something was being built against her. A silent narrative that was slowly turning her into someone who could no longer be trusted. It was then that Chloe took the next step. During a dinner with close friends of the couple, she mentioned casually, with a worried smile, that Mrs. Eleanor had forgotten the name of a person she had known for decades. Edward confirmed, embarrassed. Chloe sighed, placing a hand on her now prominent belly. "It's hard to see someone we love face these challenges, but we have to be strong and give them the support they need." The words echoed across the table like a verdict. The guests nodded in understanding. Some shared stories of elderly relatives going through similar situations. Mrs. Eleanor, seated at the head of the table as she had always been, felt the floor open up beneath her, No one looked at her with doubt. They looked at her with pity. That night, alone in her room, Mrs. Eleanor cried for the first time in years. She wasn't crying because of the injustice, but because of fear. The fear of losing not her lucidity, but her son. The fear that the web being woven around her was too strong to be undone. And the fear, above all, that the love she had built with Edward over a lifetime would not be enough to protect her from what was to come. Downstairs in the living room, Chloe and Edward talked about the future, about the child on the way, about the changes they would need to make at the company, about the responsibility of caring for Mrs. Eleanor, who, according to Chloe, deserved to live her final years with the best possible support. Edward agreed with everything, because he couldn't imagine that his wife, the mother of his child, could be constructing anything other than genuine concern. And so, as the night deepened over the Ashford-Kane mansion, three destinies intertwined in ways none of them yet fully understood. Mrs. Eleanor, caught in an invisible trap, trying to prove a sanity she had never lost. Edward, torn between two women he loved, unable to see the truth hidden behind the smiles and gentle words. And Chloe, patiently and precisely weaving the narrative that would give her absolute control over everything she had ever desired. The pearl necklace on Mrs. Eleanor's neck gleamed in the lamplight, reflecting decades of stories, promises, and secrets. That necklace, which had witnessed weddings and births, joys and losses, now watched in silence the beginning of something that would forever change the history of that family. Something that began as a suspicion, grew as a doubt, and would transform, in the months to come, into a tragedy none of them could yet imagine. Autumn was advancing outside, bringing colorful leaves and the promise of change. But inside the Ashford-Kane mansion, another season was approaching, a cold season, where truths would be buried and lies would flourish like weeds in an abandoned garden. And Mrs. Eleanor, watching from the window, as the shadows danced over the azaleas, felt in her chest the weight of what was to come, a weight that not all the love in the world would be able to lift. Winter arrived in London, bringing cold mornings and grey afternoons. The azaleas in the garden lost their autumn vibrancy, and the branches of the trees slowly bared themselves, as if nature itself knew that something in the Ashford-Kane house was also withering. Mrs. Eleanor woke every morning with a tightness in her chest, an anguish she couldn't name but that grew each day like a poisonous plant, rooted in her heart. Chloe's pregnancy progressed, and with it the transformation of the house intensified. What was once a home where tradition and modernity coexisted in balance now became a space where the past was systematically erased. Chloe constantly suggested changes. The dining room's crystal cabinet, which had belonged to Edward's great-grandmother, was replaced by a minimalist white lacquer piece. The oil paintings depicting the family's history were removed from the main walls and sent to a secondary corridor on the second floor. The grand piano that had occupied the music room since Edward was a boy was covered with a thick cloth because Chloe thought the house needed more silence to welcome the baby. Edward agreed with everything. He was so engrossed in preparing for fatherhood and the growing demands of the company that he didn't notice how much his mother was being erased along with the objects she so loved. Mrs. Eleanor tried to protest a few times, but her objections were met with a look of condescending understanding from Chloe and a tired sigh from Edward. "Mother, Chloe is just trying to make the house more suitable for the baby. It's nothing personal. It's just a matter of practicality." Mrs. Eleanor swallowed the words she wanted to say, that this house didn't need less history, but more memory, that the baby on the way deserved to know the roots of the family it would be born into, that erasing the past didn't build a future, it only created a void where nothing could stand. But she remained silent, because every time she tried to express her feelings, she saw in her son's eyes that look of concern that Chloe had so carefully planted. The look of someone observing a person who might no longer be in full capacity to judge reality. It was on a July afternoon, when a fine drizzle covered London with a sad veil, that Chloe took the next step in her carefully planned strategy. She convinced Edward that it would be important to take Mrs. Eleanor for a medical appointment. Just a routine checkup, she said, to ensure her mother-in-law's health was in order. After all, A 72-year-old woman deserved proper medical attention. Edward accepted the suggestion immediately. It made sense. It was even thoughtful of Chloe to think of her mother-in-law's well-being. He scheduled the appointment with a doctor Chloe recommended. A respected professional, she said, specializing in geriatric health. Mrs. Eleanor was informed of the appointment as if it were an outing, a break from the routine, an opportunity for Edward to spend the afternoon with her. On the scheduled day, Edward drove to the clinic located in a discreet building in the Kensington area. Mrs. Eleanor watched the city from the car window, trying to memorize every detail of that afternoon. The bustle of the streets, the hurried faces on the sidewalks, the shop windows already beginning their winter decorations. Something inside her whispered that this outing was not what it seemed. The clinic had a sterile atmosphere, with white walls, gleaming floors, and a receptionist who smiled with professional efficiency. Edward filled out the forms while Mrs. Eleanor waited in a leather-upholstered chair. She flipped through a magazine without really reading, attentive to the movements around her. She noticed the clinic didn't have many patients. The silence was almost oppressive. When they were called, a middle-aged man with greying hair and gold-rimmed glasses welcomed them into a spacious office. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Taylor and greeted Edward with an overly familiar air, as if he already knew him. Mrs. Eleanor noted the detail but said nothing. The consultation began with seemingly routine questions: how she was feeling, if she was sleeping well, if she had any pain or discomfort. Mrs. Eleanor answered truthfully, but noticed that each response was noted with an interest that went beyond medical. Dr. Taylor asked strange questions, phrased in a way to confuse. He asked her to repeat sequences of numbers. He asked what day it was, and when she answered correctly, he insisted on asking again, as if doubting her response. Edward watched everything in silence, and Mrs. Eleanor saw the concern grow on his face with each question the doctor asked. When the doctor asked her to draw a clock on a piece of paper, Mrs. Eleanor felt humiliation burn in her throat. She knew perfectly well how to draw a clock. She knew what time it was. She knew who she was, where she was, and why this man was trying to make her seem confused. At the end of the consultation, Dr. Taylor asked to speak with Edward privately. Mrs. Eleanor was led back to the waiting room, and during the 20 minutes she was alone, she felt the world around her transform into something unrecognizable. When Edward returned, there were unshed tears in his eyes and an expression of pain she hadn't seen since the day his father had passed. On the way home, Edward drove in silence. Mrs. Eleanor waited for him to share what the doctor had said, but her son just stared at the road, his lips tight, his jaw tense. When they finally arrived at the mansion, he accompanied her to the living room and asked her to sit. "Mother, Dr. Taylor explained some things that have me worried. He said, 'You're showing signs of cognitive decline. It's not severe yet, but it's progressive.' He recommended that we stay vigilant and that closer monitoring might be necessary." Mrs. Eleanor felt the floor disappear from under her feet. "Edward, I am perfectly lucid. That doctor asked confusing questions on purpose. He wanted to make me seem disoriented. I don't know what Chloe told him, but this is a setup." Edward shook his head, and in that gesture, Mrs. Eleanor saw it was too late. The seed of doubt had germinated and grown to become an unshakable truth in her son's mind. "Mother, I understand it's difficult to accept, but Dr. Taylor is a respected professional, and Chloe is only trying to help. She loves you. We just want what's best for you." Mrs. Eleanor didn't argue further. She went up to her room with the dignity of someone who knows that some battles are not won with words. She sat in the armchair by the window and watched the garden she loved so much, the flowers she had planted, the trees she had watched grow, the stones on the path she had chosen one by one. Everything was still there, but she felt she was being torn from that place, not physically, but in a much more painful way. She was being torn from her own history. In the following weeks, life in the mansion changed completely. Edward began to treat his mother with an exaggerated delicacy, as if she were made of glass and might break at any moment. Chloe took complete control of the household administration, deciding on menus, schedules, appointments. Mrs. Eleanor was gradually excluded from all important decisions. not only in the family but also in the company. The meetings that once took place in the library, with her active participation, were now held in the first-floor office. At times no one bothered to inform her of. When she asked, the response was that they didn't want to disturb her, that she deserved to rest, that she had done so much for the family, and now it was time to enjoy life without worries. But Mrs. Eleanor knew that what they called care was in fact exclusion, and what they called rest was in fact erasure. The only person in the house who still treated her normally was Joanna, the staff member responsible for cleaning and organizing the rooms. Joanna had been working at the mansion for only 6 months, having come from rural Devon in search of a job in the capital, and she had in her eyes that mix of humility and wisdom that only simple people carry. She noticed things others didn't see. She realized when Mrs. Eleanor spent sleepless nights. She heard the heavy sighs, saw the trembling hands, not from old age, but from anguish. One day, while tidying the room, Joanna approached Mrs. Eleanor and said in a low voice, almost a whisper, "Mrs. Eleanor, I don't know what's happening in this house, but you're not crazy. I see it. I know it. And if you need anything, someone who believes you, I'm here." Those words were like a balm on an open wound. Mrs. Eleanor held Joanna's hands tightly and thanked her with tear-filled eyes. Finally, someone saw. Finally, someone believed. From that day on, Joanna became more than an employee. She became a silent ally. She watched Chloe's movements, listened to conversations that took place when they thought no one was paying attention, and what she discovered was disturbing. Chloe spoke frequently on the phone, always locked in the office, always in a low voice. Joanna couldn't hear the full content of the conversations, but she caught stray words: transfers, documents, signatures, clinic. In August, Chloe went into labor. Edward rushed her to the hospital, and the house was in suspense all day and all night. Mrs. Eleanor waited in her room, praying that everything would go well, despite all the hurt and suspicion she carried. After all, this child was her grandchild, blood of her blood, a continuation of the story she had helped build. The baby girl was born at dawn, a healthy baby with dark eyes and a head of black hair that surprised everyone. Edward called his mother, his voice thick with emotion. "Mother, it's a girl, a princess. We're fine. We'll be home soon." Mrs. Eleanor cried with relief and joy. Despite everything, life went on. A new generation was arriving in the world, bringing with it the hope that not all was lost. When Chloe returned home 3 days later, the mansion was transformed. Flowers filled every room. Friends and family visited to meet little Laura, a name Chloe had chosen without consulting anyone. Mrs. Eleanor held her granddaughter in her arms and felt a mixture of love and pain. Love for that perfect little creature sleeping peacefully in her arms. Pain from knowing she might not have much time to watch her grow, not because she was ill, but because she felt something bigger was being plotted. Chloe watched her mother-in-law with the baby and smiled, but there was a coldness in that smile, as if she were just waiting for the right moment to make her next move. Edward, completely absorbed by fatherhood, noticed nothing beyond his daughter. He spent hours by the crib, watching her every movement, every breath. He was complete in a way he had never been before. It was around this time that Chloe began to mention, always with a tone of careful concern, that it might be dangerous to leave Mrs. Eleanor alone with the baby. "She might forget something important," she would say. "She might not notice if the baby is unwell. She could have an episode of confusion and end up putting Laura at risk without meaning to." Edward, who had been in a state of high alert since becoming a father, accepted all his wife's suggestions as commandments. Mrs. Eleanor was forbidden to be alone with her granddaughter. She could hold her, she could look at her, she could sing lullabies, but always under supervision. The humiliation was silent, but sharp. Joanna watched everything and felt anger grow in her chest. She came from a large family where grandparents were pillars of wisdom and care. Seeing Mrs. Eleanor treated as a threat to her own granddaughter was something that revolted her soul. In September, Chloe raised the issue she had been preparing for months. During dinner, with the baby sleeping in the electronic bassinet beside the table, she looked at Edward with that expression of someone about to make a difficult but necessary decision. "Darling, we need to talk about your mother. Edward stopped eating, his fork suspended mid-air. What happened? Chloe sighed, adjusted the napkin on her lap, and chose her words carefully. I've been thinking a lot about this. Your mother is getting worse, I've noticed. Yesterday she asked me if we had already chosen the baby's name. Edward, Laura is almost a month old, and 2 weeks ago she forgot she had arranged a lunch with her friends. She waited for them here at home, but the lunch was at the Yay Club? Edward felt his chest tighten. I didn't know about that. Because I didn't want to worry you. But now, with Laura here, we need to think about solutions. Your mother needs specialized care, a place where she can receive constant medical attention, where she'll be safe. Edward paled. Are you talking about an institution? Chloe took his hand, caressing it with rehearsed tenderness. It's not abandonment, darling. It's care. There are wonderful places, with all the necessary facilities, where she'll have physical therapy, neurological monitoring, adapted activities. She'll be better off than here, where she's isolated all day. No, I can't do that to her. She's my mother, Chloe. She created this home. She built all of this. And for that very reason, she deserves the best. Edward, you need to think about Laura, too. An environment with someone who is having these episodes is not safe for a baby. The mention of his daughter was the key that turned the lock of Edward's resistance. He found himself trapped between two impossibilities, abandoning his mother or putting his daughter at risk. Chloe knew exactly which choice he would make. Let me think, was all Edward could manage to say. Mrs. Eleanor was not in the room during that conversation, but Joanna was, clearing the appetizer plates, moving with the invisibility that servants learn to cultivate. She heard every word, and when she went up to Mrs. Eleanor's room to leave her nightly tea, she told her everything. Mrs. Eleanor listened in silence, her hands clasped in her lap, the pearl necklace reflecting the dim light of the lamp. When Joanna finished speaking, she simply nodded. I knew it. Deep down, I always knew it would come to this. We have to do something, Mrs. Eleanor. You can't let this happen. And what can I do, Joanna? My own son believes I'm losing my mind. The doctors have signed reports. His wife has built a perfect narrative. Who will believe me? I believe you, and there must be other people who believe you too. You have to fight. Mrs. Eleanor looked at the young employee with gratitude. Thank you for believing in me. But this is a battle I don't know if I can win. Perhaps it's better to accept what's coming and try to maintain some dignity. Joanna felt tears well up in her eyes. She couldn't accept that. Such a strong, lucid woman would simply give up. But she also understood the weariness in Mrs. Eleanor's voice, the weariness of someone who had fought her whole life and now saw everything being taken by hands she herself had helped to raise. The following week, Chloe presented Edward with 3 options for specialized institutions, all impeccable, according to her, with gardens, private rooms, first-rate medical staff. Edward visited all 3, accompanied by Chloe, who commented enthusiastically on the facilities, the activities offered, the affection the professionals showed. The one that impressed Edward the most was in Surrey, about 40 minutes from London, a place surrounded by greenery with buildings that resembled a large country house, quiet, organized, seemingly perfect. The institution's director, a helpful and well-dressed man, explained all the programs, showed the rooms, introduced some residents who seemed happy. What Edward didn't know was that this institution had a section that wasn't shown on tours, a section reserved for special cases, cases where families paid very high fees for certain patients to receive a different kind of care, a care that had more to do with silencing than with treatment. And it was precisely this section that Chloe chose for Mrs. Eleanor in a private conversation with the director, without Edward's knowledge. She paid for 6 months of hospitalization in advance, using funds she had carefully diverted from the company over the past year, funds that Mrs. Eleanor had warned existed, but which no one had believed were being misused. One October morning, Edward went up to his mother's room. He found her sitting in her armchair, looking out the window as she always did. He sat beside her and gently took her hand. "Mother, I need to talk to you about something important." Mrs. Eleanor turned to him, and in her son's eyes, she saw everything she needed to know. It wasn't necessary to hear the words. They were already written in the expression of pain and guilt he wore. "You're sending me away." Edward bowed his head, unable to meet his mother's gaze. "It's not sending you away, Mother. It's ensuring you receive the care you need, a place where you'll be safe, looked after, with all the necessary support." "I don't need support, Edward. I need my son. I need my home. I need my granddaughter." Tears finally escaped from Edward's eyes. "I'm so sorry. Mother, but I have to think of Laura. I have to think of what's best for everyone." "And what is best, Edward? Tearing me from my home? Sending me to a place where I'll be just another elderly woman forgotten by her family? The director assured me it's an excellent place. You'll like it, you'll make new friends, you'll have activities." Mrs. Eleanor pulled her hand away from his. "I built this house, Edward. Your father and I laid every brick of this place with love and work, and now you're taking me out of here as if I were a piece of old furniture that's no longer useful." Edward couldn't answer. He stood up, kissed his mother's forehead, and left the room without looking back, because he knew if he looked, he wouldn't have the courage to go on. Mrs. Eleanor was left alone. She looked around the room that had been hers for so many years, the photographs on the dresser, the curtains she had chosen, the rug she had stepped on every morning upon waking. Everything would be left behind, and with it, a part of herself would be left too. Joanna appeared at the door, her eyes red, her hands trembling. "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen." Mrs. Eleanor smiled sadly. "You did what you could, my dear, and I will be eternally grateful to have had at least one person who believed in me in this house. What will you do?" "I will do what I have always done. I will survive, and I will wait, because I know that one day the truth will come out, and when it does, my son will know that his mother was never confused. She was just being slowly erased by someone he loved more than he should have." 2 days later, a white van parked in front of the Ashford Kane mansion. 2 nurses, polite and professional, got out. Edward helped his mother down the stairs, carrying a small suitcase with clothes and personal items. Chloe watched from the bedroom window, the baby in her arms, a smile of satisfaction on her lips. Joanna watched everything from the back door, crying silently. When Mrs. Eleanor passed by her, she held her hand for a moment and whispered, "Don't forget me." "I will never forget you, Mrs. Eleanor, I promise." The van departed, taking Mrs. Eleanor away from the house she had built, the family she loved, the life she had known. Edward went back inside, found Chloe in the living room, and hugged her tightly, seeking comfort for the guilt that was already beginning to eat at his heart. And Joanna, alone at the back of the house, swore to herself that she would not let this story end here, that she would find a way to bring the truth to light, that Mrs. Eleanor would not be forgotten. But at that moment, as the van disappeared down the streets of London, Mrs. Eleanor looked out the window and saw her entire life turn into an ever more distant memory. And a single question echoed in her mind. How long would it take for her son to realize the mistake he had made? And when he did, would there still be time to fix it? The place was exactly as promised in the photographs, clean, organized, quiet. But there was something about the silence of that institution that was different from the silence of a home. It was a heavy silence laden with resignation, a silence that came not from peace, but from the absence of voices that no longer had the strength to be heard. Mrs. Eleanor was received by a nurse with a professional smile and tired eyes. She was led down white corridors that smelled of disinfectant and medicine. The room assigned to her was small, but had a window overlooking the garden, a hospital bed, a simple dresser, a synthetic leather armchair, nothing that resembled the spacious, memory-filled room she had left behind. The nurse explained the routine: breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, medication at scheduled times, recreational activities in the morning, mandatory rest in the afternoon, visits only with prior family authorization. Mrs. Eleanor listened to everything without asking questions. She knew it was pointless to question. She was there not to be cared for, but to be kept away from everything she had once called life. In the first few days, she tried to maintain her dignity. She woke up early, dressed with her usual care, went down for meals with the upright posture of someone who still remembered who she was. But she soon realized that no one there cared about dignity. The nurses treated all residents with the same mechanical cordiality. The doctors appeared for quick evaluations, asked questions without waiting for real answers, wrote prescriptions without looking patients in the eye. It was on the third day that Mrs. Eleanor met Dr. Reginald Campbell, the head of the wing where she had been placed. He was different from the other doctors she had met. He had a cold, calculating gaze. When he entered her room, he didn't introduce himself with the expected cordiality. He simply examined her medical chart, asked a few perfunctory questions, and prescribed medication. "You'll start taking this 3 times a day. It will help control anxiety and improve your sleep." Mrs. Eleanor looked at the paper where he was writing the names of the drugs. "I don't have anxiety or sleep problems, doctor." He looked up from his clipboard, a humorless smile on his lips. "Everyone here does, Mrs. Eleanor. Everyone needs help adjusting. The medication is part of the treatment." That night, when the nurse brought the pills, Mrs. Eleanor hesitated. She asked what they were, what the dosage was, what the side effects were. The nurse replied with forced patience that it was just for her well-being. Mrs. Eleanor swallowed the pills, but she felt she was swallowing much more than medicine. She was swallowing her autonomy, her ability to decide about her own body. The effects began in the first few weeks: a constant drowsiness, difficulty concentrating, the feeling of being perpetually shrouded in a fog that made the world around her less sharp. Mrs. Eleanor tried to resist. She forced herself to stay awake, to walk the corridors, to talk to other residents. But the medication was too strong, and each week the dose increased. Edward called regularly to see how his mother was. The institution's director always said she was adapting well, participating in activities, making friends. Edward believed it. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it, because the guilt he carried was only bearable if he could convince himself he had made the right choice. Chloe, for her part, never asked about her mother-in-law. She was too busy managing the company, reorganizing contracts, making transfers that no one questioned, because she now had unrestricted access to all accounts. Edward signed papers she placed before him without reading them completely, trusting that his wife was handling the business with the same competence she had shown from the beginning. Back at the mansion, Joanna couldn't forget Mrs. Eleanor. Every night before sleeping, she prayed for the mistress who had been taken away, and during the day, she watched everything that happened in the house with heightened attention. That's how she began to notice strange movements: documents being burned in the office fireplace, Chloe receiving visits from men in suits whom Edward didn't know, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when someone approached. One day, while cleaning the office, Joanna found a piece of paper that had fallen behind a bookshelf. It was a bank transfer receipt, a large sum destined for an account she didn't recognize. The date was from 2 weeks before Mrs. Eleanor was admitted. Joanna carefully folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. She didn't know exactly what to do with that information, but her instinct told her it was important. At the institution, Mrs. Eleanor fought daily against the forgetfulness the drugs tried to impose. Every night, before the medication made her sleep, she repeated to herself who she was: Eleanor Ashford Kane, mother of Edward, grandmother of Laura, owner of a house in Kensington, wife of a man who built an empire with honest work. She repeated these truths like mantras, trying to engrave in her memory what the chemicals were trying to erase. It was during one of these nights that she met the woman who would change everything. She was a cleaning lady, a short, dark-skinned woman with kind eyes. She entered Mrs. Eleanor's room for the nightly cleaning and found her sitting on the bed, murmuring to herself. She approached cautiously. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Mrs. Eleanor looked at her, her eyes hazed by medication but still conscious. "I'm trying not to forget who I am." The woman sat on the edge of the bed. "My name is Rose. I've worked here for many years, and I've seen many stories like yours." "How do you know what my story is?" Rose smiled sadly. "Because I see it. You're not like the others here. You have lucidity in your eyes, you have memory, but you're being medicated as if you don't." Mrs. Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes. No one believes me. My own son sent me here thinking I was losing my mind. I believe you, and I'll do what I can to help. From that night on, Rose became much more than a cleaning lady. She became Mrs. Eleanor's guardian. She visited her room every night, always under the pretext of cleaning, but really to talk, to keep her mind active, to remind her that there was still humanity in that cold place. Rose brought small gifts hidden in her uniform pockets, a fresh fruit from the garden, a flower she had picked on the way, a note with a prayer. They were simple gestures, but they gave Mrs. Eleanor back the feeling that she was still seen, as a person, not just another clinical case. And Rose did something even more important. She wrote down everything she saw. The times Mrs. Eleanor's medication was increased, the visits Dr. Campbell made to the room without any apparent medical need, the conversations the nurses had about orders coming from outside the institution. Rose didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew something was very wrong. The months passed slowly. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. Mrs. Eleanor felt her strength diminish each day, not because she was truly ill, but because the constant medication was destroying her body. She had lost weight. Her hair was starting to fall out. Her skin had turned pale. When she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Edward visited his mother 3 times during this period. On every visit, Mrs. Eleanor tried to talk to him, tried to make him see that she was being kept there unnecessarily, but the words came out jumbled because of the drugs. She stumbled over sentences, forgot what she was saying mid-conversation, and she saw in her son's eyes the confirmation that he believed he had made the right choice. Chloe never accompanied Edward on his visits. She always had an excuse. The baby had a fever. She had an important meeting. She wasn't feeling well. Edward accepted all the justifications because deep down he was relieved. The visits to his mother were too painful, and having Chloe by his side would only make it harder. It was on a December afternoon, when the London heat made the air heavy and hard to breathe, that Rose noticed something worrying. Mrs. Eleanor was getting worse. She no longer slept, she just lost consciousness. She didn't eat. She just automatically swallowed what was put in her mouth. She was becoming a shadow of her former self. That night, Rose made a decision. She could no longer just watch. She had to act. When her shift ended, she didn't go home. She went to the director's office, which was already empty, as the administrative workday had ended. She knew it was risky, but she had to try. She needed to find something she could use to help Mrs. Eleanor. She rummaged through drawers, folders, files. She found other patients' charts, medical reports, payment receipts, and then, in a locked folder she managed to open with a paperclip, she found what she was looking for. Documents proving Mrs. Eleanor was a special case, extra payments, specific orders about medication, a contract signed by Chloe Ashford Kane, authorizing prolonged treatment and limited family isolation. Rose photographed everything with the old phone her son had given her. The photos were blurry, but the documents were legible. She saved the images as if they were diamonds, because she knew they were the only proof Mrs. Eleanor had that she wasn't crazy, that she was being held there deliberately. But Rose knew she couldn't do anything alone. She needed someone with access to the family, someone who knew Mrs. Eleanor before all this happened. It was then that she remembered Edward's visits. He always mentioned the house, the garden, the staff who took care of everything. Rose decided she needed to find one of these people. The next day, during the one phone call Mrs. Eleanor was allowed to make that month, Rose managed to get close. Mrs. Eleanor would call the house, but it was always Chloe who answered. Short, cold, affectionless conversations. But this time another voice answered, a voice Mrs. Eleanor recognized immediately. Joanna. Joanna, my dear, how are you? Mrs. Eleanor, I've missed you so much, how are you? Before Mrs. Eleanor could answer, Rose leaned in and whispered quickly, tell her to look for documents. Tell her you need help, quickly, before they hang up. Mrs. Eleanor, still confused by the medication, tried to pass on the message. Joanna, I need you to help me. Look for documents. Something is wrong here. The line was cut. The nurse supervising the call frowned and wrote something on the chart. Mrs. Eleanor was taken back to her room and Rose followed, her heart pounding. She hoped Joanna had understood. Back at the mansion, Joanna held the phone with trembling hands. Mrs. Eleanor's voice had sounded different, weaker, more distant. But the message had been clear. Documents. Something wrong. Joanna looked around the empty office and decided it was time to search more deeply. Over the next few weeks, whenever the house was empty, Joanna searched through drawers, cabinets, files. She found copies of medical reports that contradicted each other, receipts for payments to the institution that didn't match the amounts Edward mentioned, bank transfers from the company to Chloe's personal accounts. Each discovery was a piece of a puzzle that was beginning to form a terrifying picture. Joanna kept everything in a box she hid under her bed in the small staff room where she slept. She knew she was taking a huge risk. If Chloe found out, she would be fired immediately. But she couldn't stop. Every time she thought of Mrs. Eleanor alone in that place being medicated unnecessarily, she felt she had to continue. It was on a January morning that Rose managed to do something no one thought possible. She convinced a younger, newly hired nurse to gradually reduce the dosage of Mrs. Eleanor's medication. She said there was a mistake in the prescription, that Dr. Campbell had requested the change, but had forgotten to update the chart. The nurse, inexperienced and trusting, accepted without question. In the following weeks, Mrs. Eleanor began to awaken from the chemical fog that had enveloped her for months. Her mind began to clear. Her memories returned in full force, and with them came anger. Not destructive anger, but the anger that drives, the anger that turns victims into survivors. Rose visited her room every night, and the two women planned. They needed to find a way for Mrs. Eleanor to get out of there, or at least for someone to hear her voice. Rose already had the photographed documents. Joanna was collecting evidence at the mansion, but they needed someone to connect the two ends, someone Edward trusted and who could show him the truth. It was then that Mrs. Eleanor remembered. There was a family solicitor, Mr. Martin Sanford. He had worked with her husband for decades, knew all the contracts, all the company's operations. If anyone could help, it was him. Rose got the office number and made an anonymous call. She said she had important information about the Ashford-Kane family, information Mr. Sanford needed to know. She arranged a meeting at a cafe near the institution. On a day off, she had managed to swap with a colleague. Mr. Sanford was a man of 60, with white hair, reading glasses hanging around his neck. When Rose approached his table with a brown envelope in her hands, he watched her with curiosity. "Are you the Ashford-Kane family's solicitor?" "Yes, I am. And who are you?" "My name is Rose. I work at the institution where Mrs. Eleanor is admitted, and I'm here because she is being held there against her will, under excessive medication with no real medical need." Martin frowned. "That is a very serious accusation." Rose opened the envelope and spread the photographs of the documents on the table. "This is the proof. Extra payments made by Chloe Ashford-Kane, orders for heavy medication, contracts authorizing isolation. Mrs. Eleanor has no degenerative disease. She is lucid. She always has been, but she is being silenced." Martin examined the documents with growing attention. As an experienced solicitor, he recognized irregularities when he saw them. And there were many irregularities in those papers. He looked at Rose seriously. "Why are you telling me this? What do you gain from it?" "Nothing. I gain nothing. But Mrs. Eleanor is a good person, and what they are doing to her is wrong. Someone needs to stop it." Martin gathered the photographs. "I will investigate, but I need more proof. Can you help me?" "I have an ally in the family home, a young woman named Joanna. She is also collecting documents. If you can speak with her, we'll have what you need." Martin took notes. He promised he would contact Joanna and start a discreet investigation. He couldn't act openly yet, because technically Edward was legally responsible for all decisions regarding his mother. But he could prepare the ground. He could gather enough evidence for when the time came to reveal everything. Rose returned to the institution with a lighter heart. She told Mrs. Eleanor everything, who cried with relief and hope. For the first time in months, she felt there might be a way out, that her voice might still be heard. But Chloe was not naive. She sensed something was changing. Joanna seemed too nervous. Rose, who had visited the mansion once to leave a message about Mrs. Eleanor, had aroused her suspicion. And there was that solicitor asking questions about old contracts. One night, after putting Laura to bed, Chloe locked herself in the office and made a call to the institution's director. She said she needed to transfer Mrs. Eleanor to a more restricted wing, a place with no contact with external staff, where visits were even more controlled. The director hesitated, but when Chloe mentioned an increase in the monthly payment, he agreed. The transfer was to happen the following week. Mrs. Eleanor would be moved to a wing where Rose had no access, where she would be completely isolated, and where Chloe hoped she would eventually be forgotten by everyone. But Chloe hadn't counted on one thing. A mother's love leaves marks that no distance can erase, and Edward, without knowing it, was about to find the first of those marks, a mark that would make his entire world, built on lies, begin to crumble. The discovery happened in a way no one could have predicted. The Ashford Kane mansion needed structural repairs. Old leaks that had never been fully resolved required a deeper intervention in the walls of the second floor. Edward hired a specialized company recommended by a client of the distribution firm. The team arrived on a February morning when the heat already weighed on London from the early hours. Among the hired professionals was a middle-aged woman, her face weathered by the sun, her hands calloused from work. She went up and down stairs carrying tools, measuring walls, noting points that needed attention. During the lunch break, while the other workers ate outside, she quietly entered the house to use the restroom. As she passed through the second-floor corridor, her eyes fell on a framed portrait that was leaning against the wall, clearly put there by someone who didn't know where to place it after the renovations Chloe had made. It was the portrait of an elegant woman, with dark hair tied in a chignon, wearing a pearl necklace. The woman in the portrait smiled with that serenity only truly happy people can display. The professional stopped. Her heart raced. She approached the portrait and looked closer. That necklace, those eyes, that smile. She knew that face, she knew it very well. It was Rose, the same Rose who had worked at the institution where Mrs. Eleanor was admitted. Rose who had decided to quit her job at the clinic because she could no longer bear to see what they were doing to that woman. Rose who now worked in construction, taking whatever jobs came up, trying to survive and forget what she had witnessed. But fate had other plans. Rose picked up the portrait with trembling hands. She turned it over and saw, written on the back in a firm, beautiful script, the name Eleanor Ashford Kane and the date 1985. It was her, it was really her, the woman Rose had helped for months at the institution. The woman who had been transferred to an even more isolated wing weeks after Rose had left. The woman everyone in the mansion believed was no longer with them. Rose came down the stairs holding the portrait. She had to talk to someone. She had to tell what she knew. She found Joanna in the kitchen, preparing juice for the workers. She approached her cautiously. "Have you worked here long?" Joanna turned, surprised by the question. "I have. Why?" Rose showed her the portrait. "Who is this woman?" Joanna felt the air leave her lungs. That portrait, that face she loved so much and missed so dearly. "That's Mrs. Eleanor, Dr. Edward's mother. She's no longer with us." Rose shook her head vigorously. "Yes, she is. She's alive. I took care of her for months in an institution in Surrey, and when I left there she was still admitted, over-medicated, isolated, but alive." Joanna dropped the glass she was holding. The sound of it shattering on the floor echoed through the kitchen, but neither woman cared. Joanna grabbed Rose's arms. "How do you know this? How can you be sure?" "Because I worked there, because I talked to her every night, because I tried to help, and because I know she was kept in that institution long after the family said she had passed." The two women looked at each other with a mixture of horror and hope. Joanna ran to her small room, where she kept the box with all the documents she had collected over the months. She brought everything for Rose to see. The receipts, the transfers, the contradictory reports. It all fit. "We have to tell Dr. Edward," said Joanna, her voice trembling. Rose agreed. "But we have to do it the right way. He needs to see the proof. He needs to understand he's been deceived. That evening, when Edward arrived home from work, he found Joanna waiting for him in the entrance hall. She held a box in her hands and had a determination in her eyes he had never seen before. "Dr. Edward, I need to speak with you. It's urgent. It's about Mrs. Eleanor." Edward felt his heart clench. Since his mother had been admitted, any mention of her brought a pain he tried to ignore. "Joanna, my mother is being well cared for. There's nothing to worry about." "With all due respect, sir, you are mistaken, and I have proof." Edward looked at the box, then at Joanna. Something in her tone, in the seriousness of her eyes, made him pay attention. "Let's go to the library. I don't want Chloe to hear us." In the library, Joanna spread all the documents she had collected on the mahogany table: receipts, transfers, contracts. Rose, who had slipped in through the back door after Joanna gave a signal, joined them, bringing the photographs she had taken at the institution. Edward spent the next 2 hours examining every paper, at first with skepticism, then with growing concern, and finally with absolute horror. Each document was a piece of a truth he had refused to see. The irregular transfers his mother had warned about, the extra payments to the institution he knew nothing of, the medication orders that made no medical sense, and most shockingly, contracts signed by Chloe authorizing treatments he had never approved. "This can't be happening," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I trusted her. I believed every word." "Dr. Edward," Rose said softly, "your mother is alive. She's in that institution, and she needs you." Edward stood up abruptly, his legs almost giving way. He ran his hands over his face, trying to process the avalanche of information. "I have to go there. I have to see her now." "It's too late for visits," Joanna reasoned. "But you can go tomorrow. And this time, go without calling ahead. Go straight there." Edward agreed. He spent a sleepless night in the library, rereading every document, trying to understand how he hadn't noticed, how he had allowed this to happen, how he had been so blinded by his love for Chloe that he had betrayed the love he had always felt for his mother. At dawn, without telling Chloe, Edward left the house. He drove to Surrey with his heart in his throat. He arrived at the institution before 8 in the morning and demanded to see his mother immediately. The director, surprised by the unexpected visit, tried to delay. He said Mrs. Eleanor was resting, that it wasn't a good time, that it would be better to schedule an appointment. But Edward was no longer the obedient son who accepted every excuse. He was a man who had just discovered he had been brutally deceived. "I am going to see my mother now, and if you try to stop me, I will call the police and turn this into a public scandal." The director, realizing he had no choice, led Edward to the most isolated wing of the institution, a place he had never seen before, with locked doors and empty corridors. They opened a door at the end of the hall, and Edward entered. The room was small, almost claustrophobic. A bed, a nightstand, a barred window, and on that bed lay a woman he barely recognized. Thin, pale, her hair sparse and lifeless, but when she opened her eyes and saw him standing in the doorway, something changed. Her eyes, those brown eyes he had known his whole life, lit up with painful recognition. "Edward," she whispered, her voice hoarse from so much silence. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, taking her hands in his. "Mother, my godmother, what have they done to you?" Mrs. Eleanor touched her son's face with trembling fingers. "You came. I always knew you would. I told Rose. I said that when you were ready to see the truth, you would come back." Edward cried as he hadn't cried since he was a boy. He cried for the mother he had mistreated, for the trust he had betrayed, for the months of suffering she had endured alone. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have trusted you. You were torn, my son. Love does that to people. But you are here now, and that's what matters." Edward demanded that independent doctors be called. He demanded that all medical records be made available. In the following days, specialists confirmed what he already knew in his heart. Mrs. Eleanor had no degenerative disease. She never had. The heavy medication she had received for months had caused damage, but it was temporary. With proper care, she would recover. Edward began the process of getting his mother out of there. But first he had to confront Chloe. He needed to hear the truth from her own mouth, the truth he already knew from the documents. He returned to the mansion on a rainy afternoon. Chloe was in the living room, playing with Laura, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. When she saw Edward enter, she smiled with that naturalness he had once found charming and now recognized as a mask. "Darling, you're back early. Did something happen?" Edward didn't smile back. He sat in the armchair opposite her, his gaze cold. "Yes, something happened. I found out what you did." Chloe paled, but tried to maintain her composure. "What are you talking about?" "About my mother. The false documents, the irregular payments. Everything, Chloe. I know everything." The silence that followed was heavy. Laura, sensing the tension, began to cry. Chloe picked up her daughter, unconsciously using her as a shield. "Edward, you don't understand. I did it all for our family. Your mother was interfering with the business. She was stopping us from growing. My mother was trying to warn us about your embezzlement. And you, instead of admitting you were wrong, built a lie so big it destroyed our family." Chloe tried to defend herself, but every word she spoke only confirmed her guilt. She spoke of her fear of losing everything, of the pressure of belonging to that family, of how Mrs. Eleanor's presence made her feel small, inadequate. But Edward didn't want to hear justifications. He just wanted it to be over. "I'm going to get my mother. I'm bringing her back home, and you, Chloe, are going to leave. I'm starting the separation process, and I will make sure you answer legally for everything you've done." Chloe tried to argue, pleaded, cried, but Edward was firm. He called the solicitor, Mr. Martin Sanford, who was already prepared with all the necessary documentation. Within days, Chloe was removed from the company's management. A full audit was initiated. The misappropriation of funds was mapped out. The substantial amounts would be recovered through legal action. A week later, Edward returned to the institution with a private medical team. He brought Mrs. Eleanor back home in a fully equipped ambulance, with nurses who would care for her during her recovery. When the ambulance parked in front of the mansion, Joanna was waiting at the door, crying with emotion. Mrs. Eleanor got out of the ambulance supported by Edward and a nurse. She was frail, but there was a renewed dignity in her posture. When she entered the house she hadn't seen in almost a year, she stopped in the hall and looked around. The walls Chloe had painted white had been repainted in their original colors. The family portraits were back in their places. And in the music room, the grand piano was uncovered, waiting. Edward led his mother to her room. Everything was as she had left it. The curtains she had chosen, the rug she had stepped on for decades, the photographs on the dresser. Joanna had taken care to make everything perfect, every object in its right place, every detail attended to with love. "Welcome back, Mrs. Eleanor," Joanna said, holding her mistress's hands. "Thank you, my dear. Thank you for never giving up on me." In the weeks that followed, the house came back to life. Mrs. Eleanor recovered slowly with daily medical care, physical therapy, and proper nutrition. Edward began working from home to be near her. In the evenings, they would sit together in the library and talk about everything that had happened, about the wrong choices, about the signs he had ignored, about the forgiveness she offered without him needing to ask. Chloe was sued both civilly and criminally. Forgery of documents, embezzlement, unlawful confinement. The cases moved forward, and she would face the consequences of every choice she had made. The divorce was granted, and custody of Laura was shared. But, with Edward having primary custody, Rose returned to work at the mansion, not as a cleaner, but as Mrs. Eleanor's companion. The two women who had helped each other through the darkest times now enjoyed a true friendship, built on respect and gratitude. Mr. Martin Sanford, the solicitor who had helped unravel the whole scheme, began advising the family not only on business matters, but also on the creation of a project that Mrs. Eleanor and Edward had conceived together. It would be a foundation dedicated to protecting elderly people who were victims of neglect, wrongful institutionalization, and family manipulation. The foundation would be named after Edward's father, who had built the family empire with honesty and hard work. It would be a legacy that honored his memory and transformed Mrs. Eleanor's pain into protection for others in similar situations. On an autumn afternoon, as the leaves began to color the gardens of London, Edward and Mrs. Eleanor were sitting on the veranda. Laura, now almost 2, was playing on the lawn, chasing butterflies with the innocent joy of children. The little girl was growing up surrounded by love, by truth, by stories her grandmother told about the family she would one day inherit. Mrs. Eleanor was once again wearing the pearl necklace she had received on her wedding day, the necklace that had witnessed so many stories, that had survived everything, that now shone in the afternoon sun as a symbol of resistance and rebirth. "Edward," she said softly, taking her son's hand, "I need you to know something. I never stopped believing in you. Even in the most difficult moments, I knew you would come back. Because the love between a mother and son is stronger than any lie." Edward squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of every word. "I will never stop believing in you either, Mother, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost." "We don't need to make up for anything, my son. We just need to live with truth, to live with love, and to teach Laura that family is not about a surname or an estate. It's about being present, it's about believing, it's about never giving up on each other." At that moment, as the sun set over the gardens of the Ashford Kane mansion, 3 generations were gathered. The past had been confronted, the truth had prevailed, and the future, uncertain as it always is, seemed a little less daunting when built on honest foundations. Joanna watched from the kitchen window, preparing dinner for the family. She smiled at the scene. 3 generations, 3 women who, each in her own way, showed that strength is not noise. Strength is resisting in silence when necessary, but it is also shouting when the truth needs to be heard. Rose was by her side, helping with the preparations. The 2 simple women from humble origins who became instrumental in saving a family that was destroying itself from within. They knew they weren't heroes. They were just people who decided to do the right thing even when it was difficult, even when it was risky. That night, during dinner, Edward announced that the foundation was ready to be launched. It would have its headquarters in a building in central London, a multidisciplinary team, and would provide free services to elderly people and their families in vulnerable situations. "Every case we handle," Edward said, looking at his mother, "will be a reminder that no facade can forever sustain that which was meant to be revealed. Every person we help will be a way of turning our pain into purpose." Mrs. Eleanor raised the glass of juice she was holding. "Then let's toast to the truth, to new beginnings, and to the love that, even when dormant, awakens when someone dares to remember." The glasses met in the center of the table. Laura clapped her hands, not understanding the significance of the moment, but feeling the joy that filled the air. And at that instant, in the mansion that had almost been destroyed by lies, the Ashford Kane family was reborn. Not as it was before, because some things, once broken, never go back to being exactly the same, but as something new, something stronger, something built on the certainty that the truth, however painful, is always preferable to the most comfortable of lies. The following months brought more healing. Mrs. Eleanor fully recovered her health, returned to walking through the gardens, and once again tended to the flowers she loved so much. Edward learned to trust again, but this time with his eyes open, attentive to the signs, respectful of his mother's opinions. Laura grew up in an environment where stories were told without masks, where the past was honored without idealization, where the future was built with transparency. And Chloe? She remained in the city, but distant from the family. She complied with court orders, saw her daughter at the times set by the court, but would never again be part of that house. They say she changed, that she tried to atone, but there were wounds that couldn't be healed by repentance alone. There were consequences that had to be lived out to the end. The foundation grew. It handled hundreds of cases in its first year, stories similar to Mrs. Eleanor's. Elderly people estranged from their families for financial gain. People institutionalized without need. Lives erased before time took them naturally. Each case was treated with seriousness, with respect, with the determination to see justice done. And at every foundation event, at every new branch opening, at every lecture on the rights of the elderly, Mrs. Eleanor was present, not as a victim telling her tragedy, but as a survivor sharing her victory. Her voice, which they had tried to silence with drugs and isolation, now echoed in halls full of people who needed to hear it. Edward learned to play the piano again. Every afternoon before dinner, he would sit at the instrument his mother had so loved and that Chloe had tried to silence. He played the songs he had learned as a boy. And Mrs. Eleanor, sitting in her favorite armchair, would listen with her eyes closed, a serene smile on her lips. Laura was learning to walk amidst true stories, about the great-grandmother she never met, but who built everything with honest work, about the grandmother who survived the impossible, about the father who had the courage to admit his mistakes and start over. She would grow up knowing that family isn't perfect, it's real. And so while London continued its frantic pace outside, inside the Ashford Kane mansion, time flowed differently, slower, more consciously, more gratefully. Because everyone there knew the value of being together, the privilege of being able to look into each other's eyes and see truth, the blessing of being able to say "I love you" and know that those words hid no ulterior motives. The story of the Ashford Kane family became, for those who knew it, a testament that silence can kill as much as poison, that appearances can destroy as much as violence, but also a testament that truth, however long it takes, finds its way, that love, even when dormant, awakens when someone dares to remember. And that family, true family, is the one that remains, even when all seems lost. Mrs. Eleanor would live for many more years. She would see Laura grow up, go to university, make her own choices. She would see the foundation expand to other cities. She would see Edward find love again, this time with someone who respected both him and his mother. She would see the gardens change with the seasons, the flowers bloom and die, life continue with its imperfect and wonderful beauty. And when, many years later, her time to depart naturally came, it would be in her own bed, in her own home, surrounded by all who loved her. It would be with the pearl necklace around her neck and the certainty that she had lived with dignity to her last day. It would be knowing that her story had not ended in that cold institution, but had continued, flourished, and served as a light for many others walking in similar darkness. But for now, on that autumn afternoon, with the sun casting golden shadows on the lawn, with Laura chasing butterflies, with Edward at the piano and Joanna and Rose in the kitchen preparing dinner, life was exactly as it should be, imperfect, true, and absolutely worth living. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Eleanor, Edward, and the Ashford Kane family has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, revelation, and new beginnings, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. This story teaches us that the truth, however painful, is always the path to liberation, and that true love withstands all storms. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, the complexities of family relationships, and the power of resilience. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with a new story that will stir your emotions.